In just 3 minutes, JD Vance slammed his fist, leaned into the mic, and snarled, "Maybe you should get out of America." The room didn't gasp, it cracked. Jasmine Crockett rose like a storm dressed in silence. She didn't shout, she detonated. What truth did she unleash that made a U.S. senator wish the cameras had never been rolling? The red tally light blinked once, then locked into a cold, unblinking stare. Live, unfiltered, unforgiving. Room 214 of the Capitol Oversight Committee was no longer just a hearing room. It was a battleground disguised in mahogany and microphones. The American flag hung stiff behind the panel, like a prop waiting for its cue, and every news camera panned with predator stillness, waiting for the kill shot. At the center sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her navy blue suit was tailored to precision, but it wasn't fashion, it was armor. Her expression unreadable. Not cold, not warm, just composed. The kind of stillness that warned you a storm wasn't coming, it had already arrived and you hadn't noticed. She adjusted the mic, cleared her throat once. No papers shuffled, no pens clicked. Only her voice broke the silence. "Mr. Chairman," she began evenly, "we are here today to discuss the systematic expulsion of military veterans men who put their lives on the line for a country that now pretends they're disposable." Pause. 3 of them deported this month. 1 served 2 tours in Afghanistan. 1 was awarded a Bronze Star. All 3 now live in exile because their paperwork didn't match the blood they spilled. JD Vance shifted in his chair. His lips twitched. He was waiting. Jasmine's voice didn't shake. "When we say, thank you for your service, what we really mean is, until you inconvenience us. And for these veterans, Latino, Black, Haitian, the price of serving is to be forgotten." A murmur rippled through the chamber. The press gallery leaned in. Jasmine continued calm and deliberate, like someone placing dynamite stick by stick on the floor of polite politics. "The hypocrisy isn't just shameful," she said. "It's policy." Then came the moment. The snap. JD Vance leaned into his mic, cutting her off mid-sentence. "You're always tearing this country down, Congresswoman," he said, tone already edged with contempt. "Always dividing people. Always painting America as the villain." Jasmine stopped. Her eyes met his, but her face gave nothing away. JD raised his voice. His words grew sharper. "If you hate this country so much..." He paused just enough to make it sting. "Then maybe you should get out." Silence. No one moved. Not even the guards. It didn't feel like a gaffe. It felt like a detonation. Deliberate, measured, meant to wound. Somewhere in the back of the room, a camera light flickered like a fuse. A woman in the gallery gasped aloud. A staffer dropped their pen. The chairman blinked. Senator, let's maintain decorum, please." But it was too late. The phrase had already left his lips, already clipped into headlines, already screamed across screens. Jasmine didn't move for 3 full seconds. She stared straight ahead, her hands folded lightly on the desk. Then quietly, decisively, she reached for her glass, took a small sip, and placed it down with precision. Then she spoke. "Senator," she began, "I was born in Texas. My grandfather laid railroad tracks for a nation that paid him in insults. My father delivered mail through neighborhoods that posted no colors on their gates. And I'm here elected because the people of my district believe that America doesn't belong to just you." JD Vance blinked. His jaw shifted, slightly clenched. But Jasmine wasn't done. "You don't get to define patriotism just because you bought the microphone. And you definitely don't get to tell me to leave a country my ancestors helped build while yours signed deeds to own them." The air split. A low hum swept through the room, half disbelief, half awe. Across the aisle, Rep. Ayanna Pressley smiled just barely. Rep. Maxwell Frost raised his eyebrows and leaned forward. The chairman tried again. Let's bring this back to policy." But no one was listening. Jasmine stared into the camera now. Not at JD, not at the panel, but into the lens, into the homes of every American watching. "You want to tell me to leave," she said softly. "Fine. But understand this, every time someone like me leaves, this country gets a little smaller. And I'm not leaving, I'm staying. To make sure you never get the last word again." Phones across the nation lit up, tweets flew, hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Crockett stays, she belongs. Get out goes both ways. But the real question, one that burned behind every blinking cursor, every whispered breath across the gallery, was this. What happens when the woman you tried to silence, decides she's not going anywhere. The room was still holding its breath. JD Vance leaned back in his chair like a man who believed he'd won something. Across the panel, aides pretended to review documents they weren't reading. Behind the cameras, no one blinked. The live feed didn't cut, it zoomed, and Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She sat perfectly still, one hand resting on the table, the other curled loosely at her side. Her eyes weren't fixed on Vance anymore. They had turned inward, somewhere quieter, somewhere colder. She heard again the sound of her father's boots leaving at 4 a.m. postal uniform, crisp spine straighter than most men in Congress. Rain or snow, insult or smile, he carried that mailbag like it was a flag no one could take from him. And still one winter, she remembered a man had slammed the door on him and shouted, "You people don't belong here." She had been 9. The memory slid into another, her mother crying softly in the living room, a rejected voter registration letter in her hands. Wrong ID, wrong district, wrong skin. She didn't understand it then, but she does now. Disenfranchisement doesn't need a gun when it has a clipboard. And behind those memories, fresh ones. Men in her district with calloused hands and missing paperwork. Honduran women holding U.S.-born babies who knew the Pledge of Allegiance, but not what asylum meant. Jasmine had looked into those faces 1,000 times and never once told them to leave. Her jaw tightened, just barely. Then slowly, she stood. The chair creaked, a sound small but seismic. Every head turned. She didn't rush. She didn't adjust her mic. She didn't clear her throat. She just stared at the man across from her, the one who'd told her to get out of her own country, like he was offering directions to the bus stop. "Senator," she said, and the word hit the air like a loaded trigger. "I was born in Texas," she continued, voice calm, but lined with flint. "My grandfather built highways under laws that wouldn't let him walk through the front door of the restaurants he paved roads to." Vance shifted in his seat, but Jasmine didn't blink. "My father delivered mail in neighborhoods where police followed his truck like it was suspicious for a black man to move freely. And still he waved. Every house, every flag, cameras pressed closer. A bead of sweat touched JD's temple. The chairman's gavel hovered, unsure whether to fall or flee. "My district," she said, "is home to veterans, teachers, nurses, and small business owners who've never known a day of privilege in their lives, but they keep building this country like they still believe in it." She stepped forward once. Not threatening, just undeniable. "So when you tell me to get out," she paused, let the silence expand, "you're not speaking to me. You're speaking to generations of Americans who never got invited to the table and still brought something to eat." Gasps fluttered. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Damn." Jasmine glanced once toward the camera again, then turned back to JD. "You don't get to rewrite the map, redraw the borders, and then tell me I don't belong on it." And in that moment, the line between citizen and symbol blurred. She wasn't just answering a senator. She was answering history. And the only thing more terrifying than her words was how calm she still was. But what does a country do when the woman it tried to erase steps into the light and refuses to flinch? The silence didn't stay in the chamber. It leaked. Through cables, through fiber optics, through the glowing veins of phones and televisions. Within seconds, the words, "Maybe you should get out of America," had fractured the internet into fire. On Twitter, "Get out of America" surged past 500,000 mentions before Jasmine even sat back down. A counter hashtag Crockett stays followed like a tidal wave, angrier, louder, and far more personal. Screens filled with Jasmine's image mid-sentence, her voice clipped into short reels with captions like, "She didn't flinch. She answered for all of us." Inside the hearing room, a different kind of current stirred. JD Vance's shoulders stiffened. He wiped his palm on the side of his suit jacket twice. Jasmine remained standing, unmoved, unreadable, but the damage had already begun moving in every direction. Cutaways showed stunned faces frozen in real time. A veteran in the gallery medals pinned to his blazer lowered his eyes in disbelief. 2 foreign dignitaries, one from Ghana, one from Germany, exchanged quiet glances across their folded hands. Even seasoned journalists trained to appear unshaken were no longer typing. They were staring. At MSNBC headquarters, a senior anchor removed her earpiece mid-sentence and whispered off camera, "Did he actually say that?" Her producer nodded. "It's trending in 22 countries. The C-SPAN live feed did not cut. There were no delays, no protective buffers. The world was watching raw power shift, and no one could look away." Jasmine's staff, seated behind her in the second row, exchanged sharp, nervous glances. One of them, Maya, her communications director, was already flipping through her emergency media playbook. But there were no protocols for this, not for what it had just become. This wasn't about one sentence anymore. Jasmine's chief of staff, Marcus, leaned in and whispered, "Do we pull her from the rest of the session?" Maya shook her head, eyes locked on the congresswoman. "No, she's not done, and neither is this." Outside the Capitol, protesters, who had been quiet only an hour ago, were now crowding near the barriers, holding up their phones, refreshing feeds, shouting. Someone had already painted the words "Get Out" in red on a poster and held it next to a printout of JD Vance's face with the word "coward" stamped beneath. But inside, the only sound now was a faint electronic hum from the broadcasting equipment. JD Vance leaned back again, this time with less certainty. His collar, freshly starched just that morning, now clung damp to his neck. His breathing had changed, shorter, shallower, and for the first time in over an hour, his gaze broke. He looked away from Jasmine. She noticed, and though she didn't speak, didn't raise a finger, the message was already thundering across America. She had him. What frightened him wasn't just the backlash. It was the quiet, the stillness in her stance, the certainty that whatever she said next would not only land, it would bury something. Somewhere beneath the marble walls and the polished wood, a shift had begun. Not just in the hearing, but in the story, in the balance of power. JD Vance was no longer controlling the narrative. Jasmine Crockett was. What secret would she drop next, and why did it suddenly feel like JD Vance already knew? It was coming for him. JD Vance didn't sit. He stood tall, chest puffed like a soldier at a rally, and reached down beside his seat. From a polished leather case, he pulled out a folded American flag, creased perfectly untouched. With a swift snap, he unfolded it, held it high over the dais, and let it hang just long enough for every camera to find it. It wasn't patriotism. It was theater. He turned toward Jasmine, his voice hardened with moral fury. "This is what matters. This country, this banner. And every time you stand there and condemn it, you're tearing apart what generations have died to defend." The flag swayed behind him like a shadow he mistook for righteousness. "You don't just disagree with America," he snapped. "You disgrace it. You trample faith. You insult the founding fathers with every accusation you hurl in this room." He lifted the flag higher. "You may have a mic, Congresswoman, but some of us still have a spine." Jasmine didn't rise. Not yet. She stared at the flag, not the man. There was no fear on her face, just the calculation of someone measuring a house of cards, seconds before collapse. Then slowly, without a word, she stood. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than his, but it landed harder. "Which founders are we praising, Senator?" She asked, her tone like cold steel and velvet. "The ones who wrote about freedom while owning black children?" The air tightened, the gallery rustled. JD's smirk twitched. The gavel struck once sharp and nervous. "Let's return to the hearing topic," the chairman urged. But no one looked at him. The room was locked in on her. Jasmine stepped forward, not aggressively, but with gravity. "You want to talk about disrespect?" she asked. "My grandfather poured tar on Texas highways in a time when he couldn't eat lunch in the same places he paved. My father wore a USPS badge and delivered mail to homes that didn't want to see his face. And still they served." She gestured lightly toward the flag. "You wave that like it's a shield. But to some of us it's also a bruise. A wound wrapped in stars. Not because we hate it, because we bled beneath it and still dared to believe in it." JD opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. For the first time, his certainty cracked. He glanced at the flag again, as if it might speak for him. "You say I disgrace faith," Jasmine continued, "but the God I believe in doesn't call for cages or closed borders or selective compassion. The Jesus I learned about didn't ask for passports before he healed the sick." Someone in the back gasped. Another whispered, "Did she just say that on record?" The chairman's hand hovered again near the gavel but didn't move. "I don't disrespect America," she said, eyes now cutting through the whole panel. "I'm holding it accountable. There's a difference. One asks for silence. The other demands sacrifice." She paused, then turned fully toward JD, her final words cold and clean. "You may carry that flag, Senator, but don't you dare pretend you understand what it's made of. If symbols can't protect you from the truth, then what happens when the truth steps into the light wearing your nation's colors?" Jasmine didn't sit down. As the weight of her last words settled across the chamber like ash, she reached for a leather folder beneath her chair, smaller than a briefcase, older than her notes. Her fingers moved gently, deliberately. She opened it, not with anger but reverence, and then she lifted it into the air. It was a flag. Folded triangle. Stars only. Crisp but worn at the edges, the kind of creases that don't come from display but from time. The room stopped moving. JD Vance's eyes locked on it with visible confusion, like a man watching a mirror form from smoke. This, Jasmine said, holding it steady in both hands, is not the kind of flag you wave when you're trying to win an argument. This is the kind they give you when you're trying to breathe through the burial of someone who never got the country they died for. The silence grew heavier. Even the air conditioning seemed to dim. She looked down at the folded fabric. My cousin, Specialist David R. Johnson, age 27, killed by an IED in Helmand Province. He was 2 months from finishing his final deployment. Her voice didn't tremble. It cut. He'd been trying to get treatment from the VA for seizures that started after his second tour. They denied his paperwork, said it was incomplete. He died before the system could call him back. She turned the flag slowly toward the panel. So when you tell me I don't respect this country, when you try to shame me with symbols, understand this: I've held the real cost of patriotism in my arms. I've buried it. JD blinked. Hard. The flag in his own hand now looked smaller, cheaper, like a prop from a theater that no longer fooled the audience. The camera zoomed in on his face, jaw tense, lips thin, a pale shade creeping up his neck. Jasmine didn't need to shout. Her words carried because they were heavier than noise. This is the flag I cried into, she said, eyes glassy but unbroken. This is the one they handed my aunt after they zipped her only son into a bag and promised her he'd be remembered. A reporter in the gallery wiped her cheek with a sleeve. A man in uniform lowered his head. Someone muttered, "This isn't a hearing anymore. It's history." Jasmine placed the folded flag back on the desk with care, like returning a soul to earth. She didn't touch her notes. She didn't need them. "You say I'm ungrateful, Senator," she said, voice low and rising. "I've given more to this country in silence than you ever will in speeches. Don't you dare lecture me about loving it." JD shifted in his chair. No words came, just the tightening of his throat and the sound of silence closing in around him like judgment. And still Jasmine didn't look at him. She looked into the cameras again, into America. How many flags have we folded? Before we realized it wasn't loyalty that was missing, it was justice. The room hadn't moved since Jasmine laid the folded flag down. Not the panel, not the press, not even JD Vance. He sat stone-still, eyes fixed on the wood grain of the desk, hands clenched as if gripping something that was already gone. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She nodded once toward the AV assistant. The screen behind the panel flickered to life. The first clip rolled JD Vance at a 2022 campaign rally in Ohio. Voice lifted with reverence. "The Ukrainian people are heroes," he said on screen. "They fight for freedom with the courage our own government has forgotten. We should welcome them because bravery recognizes bravery." Applause from the crowd in the clip. American flags waved behind him. Then the screen jump cut to a town hall 6 months later. JD in a different suit, different tone. "Illegal immigrants from Mexico aren't just a burden," he said. "They're criminals, invaders, and we must treat them as such before they dismantle our culture." No applause this time. Just silence in the hearing room as the echo of his own words burned through the air like acid. Jasmine stepped back into frame, her arms crossed, gaze unwavering. "Bravery recognizes bravery. Unless it crosses the southern border," she said, quoting him, her voice like a cold knife through velvet. JD didn't respond. Couldn't. The room already had. Behind the panel, a man in uniform slowly stood. Gray hair, bronze star on his lapel. His back was straight, his hand rising in a deliberate salute. Not to JD, not to the chairman, but to Jasmine. His lips didn't move, but his eyes did. They said everything. Jasmine bowed her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Her voice softened. "The veteran you just saw, Private First Class Miguel Ortega, was deported after serving 2 tours in Iraq," she said. "You called him a criminal, Senator. You called his mother a threat to American values. But his blood is still in Kandahar." She turned to the rest of the panel. "How many of you clapped when he went to war but locked your doors when he came home?" No one spoke. No one dared. Jasmine's eyes returned to JD, now visibly sweating, jaw-tight fingers twitching near his notes. "This hearing isn't about border policy," she said. "It's about selective memory. about which lives we mourn, which flags we fold, and which ones we pretend never carried a gun for us. The screen behind her froze on JD's face from the campaign rally, smiling, hand over heart. She turned away from him and faced the room. If patriotism changes color at the border, what does that say about the nation it claims to defend? Beyond the stone columns and polished podiums of Capitol Hill, there is another America, and it doesn't wait for permission to be seen. The camera shifts to South Dallas, not the postcard version, but the one built on resilience. Gospel choirs echo between worn brick buildings. This is Jasmine Crockett's district, not lines on a map, but a battleground of memory and survival. On a sun-bleached playground, children recite the Pledge of Allegiance beside rusted monkey bars. Their voices are earnest. Their hands still flutter awkwardly over their hearts, unaware that half the country debates whether they belong here. A teacher watches from the shade, a bandage on her wrist, a clipboard in her hand, and a quiet prayer in her throat. Let them stay invisible today. Inside a modest apartment 3 blocks away, Maria, early 30s, brown eyes sharp from surviving too much, sits on a floral couch that still smells like the fabric store. She clutches a framed photo of her son. Her fingers are calloused from housekeeping jobs no one wants to talk about. My husband came here in 2009, she says, her voice steady but slow. He helped rebuild after the hurricanes, paid taxes, volunteered at our church, never once got in trouble. Her lips tighten. Then one morning, ICE showed up in front of our house. No knock, no warning. The screen flashes to grainy cell phone footage. A driveway, 2 plainclothed agents dragging a man in handcuffs, a small boy screaming in the backseat of a minivan. I called every office, Maria continues. No one picked up, until Jasmine did. The footage shifts again. Jasmine Crockett, no makeup, no escort, just her phone and a fire in her chest. She arrives on the scene just as ICE agents approach Maria's son outside a Dallas elementary school. Jasmine steps in body between boy and badge, holding out a printed legal code like it's a sword. You're not taking this child, she says. Her voice doesn't shake. The camera catches one agent hesitating, then 2. The feed went viral within hours. But Jasmine didn't come for cameras. She came because she'd been that child, powerless, invisible, in a country that only sees skin when it wants to see threat. Back in the apartment, Maria's hands tremble again. Jasmine stayed with me until my son stopped crying. She didn't make promises. She just made sure we weren't alone. Cut back to the streets. A barber sweeps hair from his stoop. A food truck opens its window. A young girl sells cold water from a cooler, while her grandmother watches with eyes that have seen generations deported, detained, and denied. Jasmine walks past them like she always does, not like a politician, but like someone raised by the same soil. In voiceover, her words cut deep. I don't need to carry a flag to prove I love this country. I've defended its people on sidewalks where laws break hearts more than they protect them. And in the hearing room miles away, JD Vance fidgets in silence. His flag has nothing to say to Maria. His speeches don't reach South Dallas. What if real patriotism isn't measured in slogans, but in who shows up when nobody else will? The camera cuts back to Washington. The hearing room feels colder now, not because of the AC, but because something has shifted. JD Vance sits stiffer than before, the American flag on his desk, limp and lifeless. His voice has gone quiet, and Jasmine Crockett hasn't even begun the real dismantling. She flips open a brown accordion folder thick with documents marked by neon tabs. No drama, no performance. Just the slow, deliberate movement of someone about to cut a mask clean off a man's face. The room tightens with anticipation. I'd like to enter into the record. She begins a letter signed by Senator Vance, dated March 16, 2022, supporting the fast-tracked approval of over 50,000 emergency refugee visas for European nationals fleeing conflict zones. She holds it up high enough for the cameras to see the signature. JD clears his throat. I stand by that decision. Jasmine doesn't blink. I'm sure you do. She flips to the next document, and here she says is an email from your office sent just 9 months later, denying similar support for Haitian families displaced by natural disasters and political violence. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. The language here is specific. The current border climate cannot support further migration from unstable regions. She looks up. Unstable regions. Senator, Haiti has been unstable since colonialism. JD shifts. His jaw tenses. But there's nowhere to run inside a room with 4 walls, 10 cameras, and one woman who isn't done yet. Jasmine steps closer to the desk. Her voice dropped sharper now, surgically controlled. Was it instability that bothered you, Senator? Or was it the skin tone of the people requesting help? A gasp escapes from the gallery. The chairman gavel raps once, but weakly. Everyone knows the story has already outpaced his authority. Jasmine turns the screen behind her on again. This time it shows two clips. One, JD Vance giving a televised interview in 2022 speaking of Ukrainian refugees as honest, hardworking, God-fearing families seeking peace. The next, him in a town hall in Georgia calling Haitian migration a threat to American structure and stability. The contrast isn't subtle. It's shocking, and it's live. Jasmine lets it hang in the air like smoke. I don't object to compassion for Ukrainian families, she says. What I object to is your selective application of humanity. What I object to is you pretending immigration is a security issue when it's really just a visibility one. She lifts a final sheet of paper, an internal memo leaked by a former Vance aide. It details a donor meeting in which the senator promised to prioritize visa paths for Christian background nations. It's signed, dated, and a damning. JD stammers. That document isn't verified, it's notarized, Jasmine snaps back. And it's yours. The room goes silent. A congressional reporter mouths the word "damn" off camera. Viewers across the country begin screen recording, tweeting, reposting. JD's name isn't trending anymore. It's unraveling. And Jasmine just stands there still. Calm, dangerous. When you sell your values to the highest bidder, what happens when the receipts finally hit the floor? JD Vance hadn't said a word since the memo dropped. His fingers drummed once, then stopped. His eyes darted toward his counsel, then to the cameras, then back to Jasmine. He looked like a man hearing footsteps behind him, slow, heavy, and getting louder. But he wasn't ready for what came next. A chime broke through the silence, soft, digital, deliberate. Jasmine leaned forward. Mr. Chairman, I request that the committee recognize remote testimony from an anonymous source, a former staff member of Senator Vance's office. She paused. Their voice has been altered for protection. Their truth hasn't. The chairman hesitated, but the damage was already done. A mechanical voice flooded the chamber, genderless, distorted, but unshakably real. I worked for Senator Vance until 8 months ago. I was present during internal briefings where immigration policy was crafted not to solve problems, but to create them. JD tensed. The room didn't move. We didn't talk about safety or legal structure. We talked polling data, fundraising spikes, voter anger. The voice lowered. The more fear we stirred, the more money came in. That was the algorithm. Gas whispered through the back row. Jasmine stood still, hands clasped in front of her. JD's aide leaned forward to whisper something, but JD raised a hand to silence him. He was listening now, too closely. We tested phrases, the whistleblower continued. Criminal invaders. Diseased. Floodgates of chaos. These weren't descriptions. They were weapons. Deployed strategically in white rural districts to make voters feel under siege. JD finally snapped. This is hearsay, fabricated testimony from a voice box. You can't allow this, but Jasmine cut him off. You don't deny the language. You just hate that it's been recorded. The voice went on. Christian European refugees approved. Haitian families buried in red tape. We were told to block anything that didn't look like America. I have emails, recordings, and receipts. JD paled. His mouth opened, then closed again. Jasmine took one step toward the dais, slow and surgical. Let the record reflect this isn't border policy. This is political marketing. The border is not broken. You monetized it. The chairman didn't even try to gavel. You didn't secure the country's senator, she continued. You sold its conscience to the highest bidder. You turned mothers into threats, children into headlines, and neighborhoods into vote tallies. Cameras zoomed in. Twitter exploded. JD Vance blinked 6 times in 9 seconds and couldn't find a word worth speaking. Jasmine leaned forward into the microphone. You turned fear into a product, but today that product turned on you. And somewhere in the gallery, a protester whispered loud enough to be picked up by a hot mic. She just ended him. So ask yourself, what's the real threat to America? The people crossing the border? Or the men getting rich every time we look away? JD Vance hadn't moved since the whistleblower's voice faded into silence. The sweat was back, beating at his temple, hidden beneath a furrowed brow and forced stillness. His posture screamed confidence, but his eyes betrayed the quiet twitch of a man trying to brace for what he couldn't control. Jasmine Crockett, however, was already turning the page both literally and metaphorically, and what she held now was heavier than testimony. She slid a manila folder across the polished wood with a single finger. Its tab read simply, "Donation Records." Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I'd like to submit these financial disclosures into the congressional record," she said calmly. "They detail over $410,000 in campaign contributions received by Senator Vance's office over a 19-month period from GEO Group CoreCivic and 4 of their PAC subsidiaries." The names landed like gunshots in a library. Gasps scattered across the hearing room. Several aides leaned forward at once, as if needing to reread what they'd just heard. "These are not just any donors," Jasmine continued. "These are for-profit prison contractors, companies that receive federal money to build and operate immigrant detention centers. The same centers currently under investigation for child separation violations, inadequate medical care, and labor abuse." JD's jaw flexed. He reached for his mic but didn't press the button. Jasmine opened the folder and pulled out the first page. "Here's a wire transfer from CoreCivic dated May 14th, 2023, $25,000 to the Vance Campaign Fund, 2 weeks before he introduced legislation to expand border detainment zones." She laid it flat. "Here's another $50,000 bundled by the same lobbyist who coordinated with Vance staff on an internal memo suggesting public demand for stricter detainment policy." The screen behind her lit up side-by-side logos of private prison companies and headlines about missing migrant children. Photos of razor-wire compounds. A quote from JD just weeks earlier. "We must detain aggressively and expand capacity immediately." Jasmine let the silence sit just long enough to grow teeth. "Senator," she said slowly, "do you know how much profit GEO Group made from migrant detention last quarter? $48 million? Do you know how many children disappeared from their records last year? 28. And yet, they still cut you a check." JD finally spoke. "These companies operate under federal oversight. Donations are legal." "Legal doesn't mean moral," Jasmine snapped. "Legal doesn't mean just. It just means you found a way to cash in on cages." Reporters in the gallery were already scrambling for quotes. The hashtag prison money trended within minutes. Outside, the protest grew louder. Jasmine walked back to the center of the panel, her voice now like a closing cell door. "You didn't just take blood money, Senator. You legislated for it. You created demand for their product, and that product is human suffering." She glanced at the folder one last time, then met JD's eyes cold, unblinking. "What kind of patriot cashes checks from companies that build walls, trap children, and call it a business plan?" The room hadn't fully recovered from the prison money bombshell, and JD Vance knew it. His credibility was bleeding out on live television. So he did what cornered men have always done when exposed. He reached for something bigger than himself. Something ancient. Something no one could argue with without seeming like a heretic. He reached for God. "I don't apologize for my values," he said, voice low and grave. "We are a nation built on Judeo-Christian principles. And Scripture makes it clear nations must protect their walls. It is not unchristian to defend sovereignty. In fact, it's commanded." He didn't shout. He didn't pound the table. His words were soft, but loaded like stones. When Nehemiah rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem, it was with a sword in one hand and faith in the other. There it was, religion wrapped around nationalism, like barbed wire through velvet. Jasmine Crockett didn't move at first. She just looked at him like someone staring at a man who had built his entire argument on the sand and dared the ocean to rise. She took a breath, then opened her leather-bound Bible worn at the edges, tucked beside her notes. It wasn't a prop. It was a weapon of truth. "Matthew 25, she said quietly, flipping to the page without looking. "I was a stranger and you did not welcome me." That's Jesus talking. Not a politician, not a king, the Son of God himself. A few members in the audience sat straighter. Others leaned in. Jasmine closed the Bible slowly and met JD's eyes. "The Christianity I was raised in didn't build walls," she said. "It tore them down. Brick by brick, heart by heart." JD opened his mouth to rebut, but she cut through him like a sword cloaked in grace. "You quote Nehemiah and claim righteousness, Senator, but you forget that Christ never defended kingdoms. He walked among the outcasts, the immigrants, the diseased. He never turned away a refugee. Not once." The screen behind her changed, an image of a crying child at the border face pressed against fencing. No narration, no statistics, just the truth in pixels. You defend your donors and call it stewardship, Jasmine said. You detain 6-year-olds and call it law. You quote scripture and forget its spirit. JD finally responded louder this time. We can't conflate faith with law. They serve different purposes. But you just did, Jasmine fired back. You invoked God to justify cruelty. You built your argument on theology, and I'm just holding you to it. The chairman looked like he wanted to gavel but didn't dare. The Bible says, do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. That's Exodus, chapter 22. Verse 21, she continued. So let me ask you, Senator, what kind of Christianity cages children? What kind of faith separates mothers from babies and dares to call it divine? The room went breathless. Someone whispered amen from the gallery. Jasmine placed her Bible on the table with both hands. Gently, firmly. You don't get to weaponize faith for politics, then act shocked when the truth shows up wearing the same book. JD Vance sat back, but then shifted forward again just slightly. He forced a breath through his nose and tapped his mic with a controlled sharpness. Congresswoman, he said, his voice calm, but sharpened like a blade dipped in ice. You speak of faith of Christ, of compassion. But I wonder, do your values extend to protecting Americans from harm or only to welcoming chaos? He gestured faintly to the panel. Because while you quote scripture, there are border towns in Texas flooded with fentanyl. There are children, American children, dying because this border you defend, like sacred ground, has become a pipeline for destruction. He leaned in. Is that the gospel you're preaching today, that sovereignty is sin and national defense is cruelty? Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't move. But when she spoke, it was like steel sliding out of silk. No, Senator, she said coldly. I'm saying that cruelty wrapped in scripture is still cruelty. And if you think fentanyl is crossing the border with Bibles and baby shoes, maybe it's not immigration you're afraid of. Maybe it's the mirror. The air turned electric, because I've seen what this country does when it's afraid. It cages, it brands, it forgets. She paused. Her voice dropped to a blade's whisper. But I didn't come here to forget. I came to remember. Loudly. JD's mouth tightened, but he didn't speak again. And in the silence, the truth stood taller than any wall he ever hoped to build. The lights on the screen glowed again, pulling the room's attention toward a live stream that flickered to life without ceremony. No graphics, no staff introduction. Just a man in a modest room seated in front of a wooden cross and sunlight bleeding through worn-stained glass. Pastor Emmanuel Mwangi, African-born, American naturalized, cleared his throat softly, but his presence filled the chamber like thunder. I speak today not with anger, he began, but with the memory of what was done in the house of God. His voice was smooth but heavy, like someone carrying names instead of notes. Last March, ICE agents entered our church during evening Bible study. No knock, no warrant, just boots on sacred floorboards. A murmur swept through the hearing room, but Jasmine remained still. JD Vance's jaw shifted slightly, arms folded too tightly across his chest. On-screen, Pastor Emmanuel placed both hands on the desk in front of him. They threw Deacon Arthur to the ground, he said. He is 72 years old. 2 women, both mothers, were detained. One was pregnant. The other was reading aloud from Psalms when the cuffs went on. The room grew quieter with every word. Not even the chairman reached for his gavel. Emmanuel continued, voice unwavering. We fled war in Nigeria to seek refuge here. We came with nothing but faith. We built that church in a strip mall brick by brick. And still to them, we were a threat. Jasmine glanced at the committee. A few members avoided her gaze. JD didn't blink. Pastor Emmanuel leaned closer to the webcam, narrowing the space between testimony and indictment. I have served my community for 18 years. I have performed weddings, funerals, baptisms, every sacred act in the book. But no prayer prepared me for the sound of children screaming as their mothers were dragged from pews. A reporter in the gallery lowered her phone, too stunned to keep filming. Then came the line that shifted the room's air. Jesus was a refugee, he said. He fled to Egypt. He was hidden by strangers, protected by grace. And yet we worship him while deporting those who walk the same path. JD shifted again, fingers tapping against the desk in a slow, nervous rhythm. The cameras caught it. Emmanuel didn't look angry. He looked tired. Tired in the way only faith can be after it's been tested and trampled by politics. You cannot preach compassion on Sunday, he said, and legislate cruelty on Monday. You cannot hold scripture in one hand and detention orders in the other. His hands opened slowly. One of them will eventually slip. The screen lingered for one last moment before fading to black. Silence. Then a slow exhale from someone in the gallery. Jasmine stood gaze locked on Vance. When the words of a refugee pastor speak louder than the laws of a senator, who exactly is doing God's work? The chamber was still reeling from the pastor's words when Jasmine Crockett quietly reached for a new folder, thin-aged and bound with twine. She didn't raise it like evidence. She cradled it like history. The cameras adjusted. JD Vance sat stiff, fingers folded tightly, as if bracing for a storm he could no longer spin. "Mr. Chairman," Jasmine said evenly, "with your consent, I'd like to submit into the record a document from the Kentucky State Archives." The chair gave a slow, uncertain nod. She untied the twine and opened the file with Carrot's contents, older than anyone in the room, but heavy enough to tilt the floor beneath them. "These are property ledgers," she explained. "Dated 1860, Greenup County, Kentucky." Her voice was calm, but inside it was flint meeting steel. "They list holdings under the name Thomas Whitaker Vance, Senator Vance's great-grandfather." JD's eyes narrowed. He adjusted his tie. "This is a political stunt," he muttered. Jasmine didn't even glance his way. "The holdings included 14 human beings," she continued, each name, age, and market value recorded in perfect cursive. Livestock had more rights than these children did, and one of them was Elijah. She lifted a single page from the file and held it up. The image projected onto the screen behind her, a scan of the ledger, clear and brutal in its simplicity. Next to the name Elijah were two numbers, age 12, value $400. Jasmine stepped closer to the microphone. He was 12, labeled as property, assigned a dollar amount like a bale of cotton. Her gaze shifted finally to JD. "He was your family's wealth, and my family's price." The room was silent, not tense, hollow. JD Vance tried to speak, but the words collapsed in his throat. His lips moved, but no sound followed. He looked less like a senator now, and more like a man trying to outrun something with no legs left under him. "I didn't come here to shame your family," Jasmine said. "History already did that." She placed the page gently on the desk between them. "But I will not sit here while the descendant of a slave owner tells me, a descendant of the enslaved, that I should leave the country my ancestors built with blood." Her voice was low and deliberate, each word a chisel. "You didn't just inherit privilege, Senator. You inherited silence, protected wealth, a platform built on backs like Elijah's." She turned back to the screen. "And for generations, men like you rewrote history to look like merit. But this," she held up the ledger again. "This is the truth. Signed, stamped, filed." The audience didn't shift. They didn't blink. Even the walls seemed to listen. JD finally found breath. "That was over 100 years ago," he said quietly. Jasmine nodded. "And yet here we are." She stared at him, unblinking. "One of us is still defending his name. The other is still defending her right to be here." She laid the folder down slowly, like closing a coffin. "When the bones of the past rise with names, who gets to decide who belongs in the present?" The ledger lay open on the desk, like a wound that never healed, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She glanced toward the gallery. From the second row, a woman stepped forward, measured, composed, with a presence that quieted even the whispering aides. Her name was Dr. Lorraine Barnes, a forensic historian and genealogist, specializing in plantation-era record reconstruction. But today, she wasn't just presenting facts. She was unraveling bloodlines. Dr. Barnes approached the panel, briefcase in hand, voice low and firm. "Over the past 6 months," she said, "my team has analyzed plantation documents, state inventories, census logs, and commercial shipping registries related to families from Greenup County, Kentucky, specifically the lineages of Representative Jasmine Crockett and Senator JD Vance." She paused. No theatrics, just the cold, sharp truth of history. Using verified DNA matches from national ancestry databases and estate transaction ledgers, she continued, "We've confirmed a direct genealogical link." The screen behind her lit up, not with names, but with two parallel trees. One labeled Vance, the other Crockett. A thin red line connected them. In 1860, Dr. Barnes said Elijah, age 12, listed as property in the Vance family ledger, was forcibly relocated from Virginia to Kentucky. His mother sold separately. He never saw her again. But Elijah lived. He had children. And 4 generations later, one of his descendants is seated before you today. The chamber froze. A soundless, sprawling stillness filled the air, as every head turned toward Jasmine Crockett. She didn't move. She simply stood slowly and looked down at the screen like a mirror made of fire. "You inherited silence," she said, turning toward JD Vance. "I inherited scars." JD shifted in his chair, his voice tight and defensive. "That was over 160 years ago. That has nothing to do with my record or this hearing." But the words rang hollow paper thin beneath the weight of the moment. No one rushed to agree with him. No one interrupted to shield him. Even the chairman's gavel remained untouched. Jasmine stepped forward, her tone precise and deliberate. The chains didn't dissolve with time. They evolved into red lines, arrests, denials, whispers behind closed doors. She glanced again at the ledger, the screen, then the room. "And when someone like me challenges the status quo, I'm told I'm angry, ungrateful, un-American." She turned back to JD. "But here's the thing, Senator. My great-great-grandfather was your family's property, and now I sit here elected by the people telling the truth your bloodline tried to erase." JD's lips parted, but no response came. "You want to pretend this is irrelevant," she said, her voice tightening, "but it's the very foundation of who gets to speak in this country and who's told to leave." Dr. Barnes remained at the side, silent, bearing witness. The bloodlines were still glowing on the screen. Two names centuries apart, one chained, one speaking. Jasmine stepped back, leaving nothing but truth in her wake. When history lives in your DNA, and the past is no longer buried, who decides which stories deserve a microphone? The chamber remained suspended in silence. Not the silence of confusion or decorum, but something deeper, something sacred. Jasmine Crockett stood at her desk, still as stone. The ancestral weight of Elijah echoing in the air like a hymn no one dared interrupt. JD Vance sat opposite her, unmoving, the bloodline on the screen glowing like a truth he couldn't edit. Then came the shift, not from the dais, not from the panel, but from the gallery. A soft rustle of fabric, a whisper, and then the sound of a single person rising to her feet. It was a young black girl, barely 12, with braids that brushed her shoulders and fire in her stance. She stood near the center row, hands trembling slightly as she held up a handmade sign. The cardboard shook at first, until the message came into view. "We're not asking to leave, we're asking to lead." Gas spread like sparks. One reporter froze mid-keystroke. A Capitol aide looked away, lips pressed shut. But Jasmine saw her, and for the first time since the hearing began, she smiled. Not out of relief, not out of victory, but recognition. Because in that one gesture, in that one girl's hands, Jasmine saw the full circle. Elijah, her father, her district. Every child who had been told to be quiet, sit down, stay grateful. That sign wasn't protest, it was permission. The chairman opened his mouth, unsure of whether to call for order. But the room ignored him. It had moved on. Something real was happening, and no gavel could stop it. JD Vance glanced up at the sign, his eyes briefly locking with the girl's. He looked down again just as quickly, as if the weight of her message was too sharp to hold. Jasmine turned fully toward the gallery, not the cameras. She nodded to the girl, her voice low but clear. "That's the truth, baby, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The girl smiled back, small but certain, and in that quiet exchange, something broke open. Not outrage, not applause, but understanding. In a room built for procedure, a 12-year-old had just redrawn the agenda. Jasmine returned to her seat, still holding that faint smile. For the first time that day, she looked less like a warrior and more like a mirror, reflecting back everything America tries to forget and everything it still hopes to become. The cameras caught the sign one last time as the girl sat back down, holding it like a torch that wouldn't go out. "If we carry the wounds of history in our names, Elijah Johnson Freeman, then isn't it time we carried the truth too?" The girl's sign had lit a spark, but with it came the fire. Within an hour of the hearing's end, Jasmine's office phone lines were jammed. Not with policy calls, but with venom. Threats cloaked as warnings. Voices hissing through the receiver, promising payback in God's name. The emails were worse. Dozens, then hundreds, piling into inboxes like poison notes. "Traitor. Go back to Africa. You'll regret embarrassing him." Most came from burner accounts, no names, no locations, just avatars of flags and eagles in rage. Her staff scanned them in silence, unsure whether to forward them to Capitol Police or to delete them before the intern saw. Then came the envelope. No return address, just her name in block letters, cut from a magazine like it was 1993 again. Inside, a photo of her childhood home in South Dallas, circled in red ink and a message scrawled beneath it in Sharpie. "You're next." Jasmine didn't flinch, but her hands gripped the edge of her desk a second longer than usual. Her chief of staff, David, wanted to call security immediately, but Jasmine shook her head. "Let them see us work," she said. "That's the real threat." That night, news broke that the smear campaign wasn't organic. It was engineered. Investigative reporters traced the avalanche of hate to a coordinated network troll farms linked to far-right PACs and international disinfo hubs. They'd used AI to generate fake black voices condemning her. They'd even deep-faked her image into foreign protest clips, claiming she burned flags. The hashtag Crockett Hates America was trending on platforms she didn't even use. But something else was trending too. Crockett stays, Elijah still speaks, she fights for us. Jasmine walked into the war room, the name her team had given the media lounge in their office, and stood before the glowing screens. Her face was everywhere. On CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Cut into a dozen different frames, a dozen twisted narratives. Saint, traitor, threat, hero. "I don't care what they call me," she said quietly. "But they won't silence me." David nodded, handing her the press brief. "They're pushing a narrative that you're dividing the country." She looked up, eyes steeled. "This country was never one thing. I'm just refusing to pretend anymore." Outside, the Capitol dome glowed under a velvet night. Somewhere beneath it, someone was planning their next move. Another email, another rumor, maybe worse. But Jasmine had lived through worse. Her ancestors had survived worse. And she wasn't going anywhere. When the truth becomes a threat, what kind of country still calls itself free? She could have stayed behind Capitol doors surrounded by armed guards and filtered microphones. But Jasmine Crockett never did her fighting from shadows. The day after the threats went public, she called for a town hall not in D.C., but in the heart of her district where fear had a face and faith wore working-class clothes. The local gym was packed by 6 p.m., folding chairs filled fast, then the bleachers, then the aisles. Cameras lined the back wall, CNN, Telemundo, even BBC. They expected policy, talking points, maybe a carefully worded condemnation of the threats. What they got instead was raw, unscripted fire. Jasmine didn't stand behind a podium. She sat in the front row with the families, mothers holding toddlers, fathers with hands still stained from roofing tar. A boy in a soccer jersey clutched his mother's sleeve as Jasmine took the mic. "They told me to get out of America," she said, voice steady. But this, she swept her hand across the crowd. "This is America." Applause rumbled, but something softer broke through. A child's voice. High, fragile, clear. "Are they going to send you away too?" he asked. The room froze. Jasmine looked down and found him no older than 7 brown eyes, wide with fear, too old for his age. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over, knelt beside him, and took his small hand in both of hers. "No, baby," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." He nodded but didn't smile. He just leaned forward and hugged her around the neck. The gym was silent except for one mother beginning to cry. Then another. Then applause erupted, not the political kind, but the kind that comes when people feel seen. Jasmine stood again, stronger, louder. "You don't scare a tree by shaking its leaves," she said into the mic. "And you don't scare me by threatening what I've already walked through. You think I'm afraid of trolls and cowards hiding behind keyboards? My grandmother faced dogs and fire hoses for less." The crowd roared. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras zoomed tighter. But Jasmine wasn't performing for them. She was anchoring something solid, ancestral, unmoved. Later that night, one of the networks tried to cut the child's question from the national edit. But the clip had already gone viral. 8 million views in 12 hours. "Crockett is not leaving" was the new rallying cry. Jasmine walked off that gym floor knowing the threats would get louder. But so would she. When a child asks if his defender will disappear, what kind of country answers with silence? The final session began like a slow drum roll. Everyone knew the climax was coming, they just didn't know who would set it off. The oversight chamber was standing room only, more cameras than seats. JD Vance sat upright, shoulders squared, his tie too tight, jaw clenched like a man prepared to reclaim the spotlight. He leaned forward, pressed his light. "Mr. Chairman," but the gavel struck. "Congresswoman Crockett has the floor," the chair interrupted. JD's mouth hung open for half a second, then snapped shut. Jasmine rose slowly, deliberately. There was no folder in her hands this time. No USB drive. No document to wave, just her voice, and her history, and the weight of every word she was about to choose like a surgeon with a scalpel. For the past week, she began, we've heard a lot about who belongs in America, about who gets to speak to, stay to be heard. Her eyes scanned the room, each row, each camera, each man who had tried to silence her. Let me be clear. I didn't come here to ask for permission. I came to represent the people who never got to speak into a microphone before they were judged. A murmur began, low, reverent. JD shifted in his seat but didn't move again. My grandfather built highways for this country while yours passed laws to divide it, she continued. My cousin died in uniform without a thank you. My neighbors pay taxes but live in fear of a knock at the door. She took a breath, let the silence settle like ash. America is not fragile, she said slowly now, each syllable carving itself into the room. But it is unfinished, and I'm not leaving until we finish what was stolen. The silence after that line didn't feel like a pause. It felt like a verdict. A few hands clapped, then more. Then the entire back of the chamber rose to their feet, not with wild cheers, but with the slow, solemn rhythm of something earned, of something that would not be forgotten. JD Vance looked away, suddenly interested in the marble floor beneath him. Outside, the chamber cable news anchors tripped over their scripts. Hashtags reignited. Emails flooded inboxes across both parties. But inside, Jasmine Crockett sat back down with nothing left to prove. She had not just survived the storm, she had named it, outlived it, and rewritten its map. She folded her hands quietly as if the roar of the country outside was someone else's to carry now. When one voice stays standing after everything is thrown at it, maybe that's the only proof a democracy still breathes. The clip hit 1 million views before Jasmine even left the building. By morning, it had breached 20. TikTok edits layered her words over gospel choirs, protest drums, and slow-motion footage of marches from Selma to Ferguson. Teens recited her closing lines in front of lockers and classrooms. An artist in Detroit painted her on a wall between Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman. Above it, in bold red, I'm not leaving. In Houston, a mural rose overnight on the side of an immigration center, Jasmine with one fist raised and a little girl gripping her other hand. Veterans from Wisconsin sent a folded flag signed with notes like, "You speak for all of us who served and were forgotten." Dreamers from Phoenix mailed photos of their families captioned, "We belong." The letters didn't stop. One came from a retired teacher in Kentucky who said her grandfather marched with Martin Luther King. "You made me believe this country could still be taught," she wrote. A janitor from the Bronx sent a single rose and a $5 bill with no return address. Jasmine read every line, every name. She didn't cry. She felt ready. Polls began to shift. Overnight support for comprehensive immigration reform jumped 10 points. But the real shock came when conservative-leaning voters, white suburban middle-age, began echoing her words in focus groups. "She made me feel proud and ashamed at the same time," one man said. "Like we've got work to do." Cable news didn't know what to do with it. They tried to bury it under coverage of gas prices and foreign affairs, but the internet had already claimed the moment. Young organizers printed her quote on protest signs. Black churches turned her speech into Sunday sermons. Even a few Senate interns whispered to reporters, "I've never seen someone turn a hearing into a movement." Meanwhile, JD Vance retreated into silence. No tweets, no rebuttal. Just a ghost in a suit who learned too late that some storms don't pass, they stay. And Jasmine, she sat in her district office in South Dallas, windows open, light pouring in like grace. She didn't speak for the cameras. She just whispered 2 words to herself, quiet and defiant. "We stay." The city outside had gone quiet, Dallas wrapped in the hush of midnight traffic and distant sirens. Inside the office, only one light was still burning. Jasmine Crockett sat alone at her desk, her blazer draped over the back of her chair, a mug of cold coffee forgotten beside a stack of letters. Her team had gone home hours ago, but she remained tracing the edges of a photograph pinned above her desk. It was old, yellowed at the corners, her grandfather in his crisp postal uniform, smiling beside a mail truck, one hand raised in salute. She stared at the picture like it was a window instead of a memory. "This job didn't make me American," she whispered, voice barely rising above the hum of the air vent. "You did." The room felt full somehow, as if the generations who'd come before were watching, waiting. Her grandfather, the cousin who died in Afghanistan, Elijah, the boy whose name she read from JD's ancestry file. Their stories weren't trophies. They were truths unfinished, like chapters waiting for a pen that wouldn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. I stayed, I spoke, and they listened. Not everyone, not the trolls, not the ones who sent threats in unmarked envelopes, but enough. Enough teachers, enough veterans, enough little girls holding signs in gallery balconies. Enough to crack something that had long been frozen. Her phone buzzed on the desk, another notification, another edit of her speech going viral, but she didn't look. For once, the outside world could wait. Her hand moved to a fresh sheet of paper, not for a bill, not for a press release, just a note to herself. A reminder maybe, a vow. She wrote 3 words in thick ink: we are unfinished. Then she folded the paper and slipped it behind the photo frame, tucked it there like a seed for the next storm. Outside, the city lights blinked like stars, learning how to breathe again. And somewhere in the distance, in a classroom, a church, a living room full of silence and TV static, a girl watched Jasmine Crockett and saw something she'd never been told she could become. What does it really mean to be American? And who gets to decide to love a country is not to turn a blind eye to its mistakes, but to face its unhealed wounds and choose to stay to help heal them. Staying like Jasmine did is sometimes the bravest act of all, because it requires not just a voice, but memory, resilience, and faith in a future still unfinished. Do you still believe in the power of truth? Or have you grown too tired to rise one more time? Share your thoughts in the comments, because the words you speak today might be the strength someone else needs tomorrow. If this story shook you, don't scroll past it. Like, share, and subscribe to Mr. Truth Stories, where voices once silenced now echo louder than ever. Hit the bell, because the next chapter won't just reveal injustice. It might demand something from us all. What part of Jasmine's stand still echoes in you? Leave a comment. Speak your truth. Let's not just witness history, we shape it together.